Since the nerfs to Mandate, after Riot decided that the support item that buffs damage shouldn't be dealing damage, it's been pretty underwhelming, and given how prevalent it is in Nami builds, I believe it's part of why her win rate is fairly low. For a while now, I've been looking for a replacement, but of course there is no obvious alternative. One option is to go straight into Mythic, the most popular of which is Shurelya's. But after the passive buffs Nami got this patch, Shurelya's doesn't actually give that much value since we bump into soft caps on movement speed. I did some testing, and in the optimal scenario where we have just the 35 AP Shurelya's gives and no boots or other move speed modifiers, casting ability which triggers Shurelya's will give an additional 58 move speed for 1.5 seconds at most every 4 seconds. If we have tier 2 boots, then this is reduced to 49, and as previously mentioned, if we add AP into the mix from items and runes, then this diminishes further. This is pretty underwhelming, and the only actual value we'll get is with the active, which is situational. Quick note, but I would like to have footage to back this up, but there appears to be a bug in Practice Tool this patch that stops Shurelya's applying to target dummies, but I still think it is rare to get value from Shurelya's passive on Nami. This leaves Helya, or AP builds, but Helya is also somewhat nerfed and has the problem that it usually ends up dealing damage to a tank or a bruiser. AP builds can feel nice when you're able to opt into them, but your Mythic alone will be an additional 500 gold while sacrificing utility for your team. But what about another option that at first seems like a complete meme, but actually might be pretty strong? It is the build I've personally been playing with since the start of the season, after building it as a joke in a normal game to warm up, but it felt quite nice, and the results thus far have been pretty good, even before the 13.15 Nami buffs. And this build is Staff of Flowing Water into Moonstone, aka the Lore Accurate Nami build. I would like to note before we get in too deep here, I don't think this is something to run every game, and it is not yet optimized since I haven't even played 20 games on it, so I don't have a coherent strategy about when to avoid it or when it's strong. For the time being, I'll probably run it unless it's obviously bad, because I want to get a feel for when it is good. Damage-wise, Mandate has been gutted, dealing 120 to 180 damage on a single target, which really isn't that much, and I don't value it. We'll come back to the damage later, because I'd like to look at just the item stats for now. They are on screen now, and just going by the base stats, for 200 more gold, Mandate gives 20 AP, 20 ability haste, 25% mana regen, and you are down 5% move speed and 8% heal and shield power. If you're doing nothing, then obviously it seems to be worse, but if you throw in the passive effect of Staff, then the comparison looks as follows. Mandate will give you 10 to 25 less AP, depending on level. You'll get 25% extra mana regen, 5% less move speed, and 8% less heal and shield power. We also give AP and ability haste to our allies too. Even if you're paired with someone that does not care at all about AP and ability haste, for example someone like Draven, we're in a strong position going off of stats alone. The move speed and heal and shield power are nice to have too. An additional 17 to 19 move speed at all points of the game is nice. And because Nami's AP ratio on W is so weak, when you compare the AP value of components for Mandate versus the heal and shield power from Idol or Staff, you're generally going to come out ahead. But that's just the stats provided by the items. We have to go back to Mandate's damage to champions. Since the damage of Mandate is quite low, if you and your allies' damage AP ratios are above a certain value, you are dealing more damage. Nami's kit AP ratio is 2.25, but that assumes that you hit everything, so it isn't a perfect comparison, and depending on how much extra AP you have from the level scaling of Staff, this ends up dealing 22 to 56 damage. Here is a spreadsheet with the numbers in case you care about peer reviewing my work. Apologies, but it's a lot of numbers. We can see that generally depending on level, if you are giving AP to an ally, then they need an AP ratio of about 2.5 in their kit in order to outperform the damage from Mandate, which isn't unheard of, but it is rare to have an ADC approach that. There are a select few who do, but it's only really mages that will deal more damage to champions with Staff compared to Mandate. Here is a simplified graphic I made, and again, I would like to emphasize that this is in a committed fight and it assumes that you don't miss your abilities. It is not perfect and it doesn't cover edge cases. One example I put in green is Brand, And in an all-in, you will do more damage with staff, but it doesn't account for the fact that Brand Nami will often do some poking before a fight, where he uses E to bounce to enemies while you give him E, and that gets poke damage from Mandate relatively easily. Most ADCs will deal less damage with staff, but again, I will stress that we're not talking about a lot. I am just mentioning it because I'm attempting to be honest. But generally, I don't think it matters that you'll be down a little bit of damage on a target at one item, because even in the worst case scenario, we're only talking about 100-ish damage. Until now, we've been as uncharitable to staff as possible, but that's just for when you've got one item and the build isn't properly online at that point. Where you get insane value from staff is when you have Moonstone completed, and staff's passive is on multiple people at any one time. If you're grouping up in the mid-game and give staff's passive to 2 to 3 allies at one time, then unless you have multiple allied champions that don't value the AP and haste from staff, your team is massively outperforming Mandate in a fight. That is an important caveat though, since certain champions don't necessarily care about those stats, and if your team has several of those, then this weakens the strength of the build. Once again, I would like to stress that this build is not yet optimized. Part of the reason I am putting it out there is so that the community at large can try this and figure out the edge cases, because I lack the free time to spam games and do it on my own. Here is a list of champions that lack AP ratios. You'll note that not all of them are to be written off as synergizing poorly with staff, since some of these champions, such as Riven, love CDR, but if they're a champion that doesn't care for haste either, then take note since they diminish the value of this build. In my opinion, the champions that don't particularly care about staff's passive are Darius, Mundo, Draven, Garen, Kazanti, Kled, Neela, Pyke, Samira, Set, Urgot, and Yone. With all that said, until now, we've focused on justifying why staff is comparable to Mandate, and we haven't touched on the strengths of the build overall. A lot of the game is about PvE, be it minions or monsters, and Mandate does absolutely nothing in terms of damage to anything other than a champion, so staff stats are more useful when it comes to matters such as accelerating the speed at which your allies can gain pride from pushing a wave, or taking a jungle camp, or taking an epic monster like Baron or Dragon. Even if it's just the jungle pet and their 12% AP damage per second, that's an additional 5-ish damage per second over Mandate. Even champions without AP ratios can make use of AP, since auto attacks on turrets will deal 60% AP damage. And this helps in siege scenarios, or even just in lane, as you push to get plays before they fall at 14 minutes. We touched on it before, but staff ends up allowing you to spike faster and in several ways. Sure, there's the obvious that it is 200 gold cheaper than Mandate, but the fact that you also get almost 20 move speed from Ether Wisp without needing to finish tier 2 boots is really good too. When going Mandate, you usually have to ask yourself, do I get tier 2 boots so I can have map impact and rotate more effectively? Or do I rush Mandate and brute force bot lane? The latter usually involves locking yourself into a rune to accelerate your income like Futures Market or Magical Footwear. Staff doesn't have that problem, since you compensate for tier 2 boots with the move speed from staff while only having tier 1 boots, all for 2400 gold in total. Unless you fall behind in lane, you will almost certainly hit the spike ahead of the enemy support and are able to abuse this timing to generate a lead. Either they get tier 2 boots and can keep up with your movement to plays but can't contest you bot in the 2v2 because they've only got components, or they rush their first item but cannot keep up with you moving first to plays with your jungler or mid laner. If you want to try this, here is the setup I've been running for runes. Very standard. I've gone back to Scorch when it comes to playing with this setup because it allows you to stand your ground and trade in most matchups in the early game and get gold from spell thieves. Yes, it doesn't scale at all, but that's not the point. We have a very strong mid-game and late game with Moonstaff, and so we can afford to run a rune that's dead after 10 minutes if it gets us to staff safely. Remember that staff applies on shielding or healing, not necessarily just by empowering a ally. We want to make sure that our AoE procs staff and Moonstone, so we should generally try using E before W in order to optimize uptime. This build is strongest when you group up with multiple team members. I recommended this build to someone I know, and a complaint they had was that in gold, people don't tend to bunch up as much, and I have to call this out. I had a game where we utterly wrecked the enemy team early, but because we had Evelyn, Akshan, and Singed, grouping and playing front to back was a rarity, and the game was much harder as a result. I, of course, don't know how a traditional build would have fared, but such a solo queue comp may be a factor which puts you off of this build, and I would advise you to be vocal of grouping up where possible. Finally, before anyone jumps down my throat, I do not wish to give the impression that this is the strongest Nami build at all times, or that it is for everyone. It is simply a build that I've had a lot of success with, and I believe it has its merits. If you try it and decide that it's not for you, that's fine. Thank you for being here regardless, and I hope you have a wonderful day.